This is on causality and the power of serious study and professional practice of decent causality in the way you run your life. We all make casual causal attributions 3 or 4 times a minute, and our brains are constantly generating causal surmises that are completely false and wrong all day long. There are distinct faults and flaws in how our brains work that cause us to misattribute causes to all kinds of things that are not actually causally related. It happens thousands of times while we read every day and while we talk in conversations every day and while we hear stuff from other things. We are constantly surmising causal relations that are false. And this is a video about undoing that and the power of people who can undo that. My first point then is that, number one, if you go to a PhD program, you spend several years being trained to stop making causal surmises when there's no data justification for them. And so it's really just a stopping training, a training in stopping this constant casual talking about causation when you don't know that that's a cause and no one knows that that's a cause. And it would take a lot of money and time to find out whether that's a cause. And just stopping you doing that. At first, most PhD programs do that only in your writing. But if you hang around long enough, and if there's a top 10 program, they'll do it in your speaking too. Just correct your speech to stop these casual surmises of causation that have no basis. And it makes you in that empty space of you're unable to just generate causal statements all the time whenever you want without basis. In that vacuum, it does create some thinking about causation and what has happened to my life on 20, 30 years of making sloppy, wrong causal surmises, and maybe I would have had a much better life if I'd made better ones. Number two, there's Buddhist causality, which is 10,000 bee stings move an elephant. And this was revived by Dr. Deming in the world's total quality movement, where he pointed out you had to change 625 things all over the system that a work problem was in order to make that one work problem permanently go away. And then he shrank that in some of his seminars to 125 changes all over the work system to make one problem permanently go away. And he pointed out how managers are constantly near where a problem appears. They're identifying one or two local causes and making them go away, and then hoping and dreaming in a kind of causal religion that that's going to make the problem go away. It never does. And so he blamed the management's lack of statistical common sense for the fact that constantly corporations are generating local, near the problem, handfuls of small countermeasures that never make the problem permanently go away, but they can make it be harder to see until the manager gets promoted. Number three. Tools for finding and validating causal mechanisms. Now, this is called policy by experiment, Bayesian policy making, or editing out brain flaws. All three of these work. And if you do policy by experiment, you structure initiatives to collect data on two things: their own actual impacts and how well they were actually implemented. Because when you get no effect, you got to know whether it's because you didn't implement it well or because it was the wrong thing to implement. And you've got to have a data system that can distinguish between those two. Now, we leaders actually do this in almost no systems that you can find in a corporation. And as a result, they're constantly saying that this didn't work when everybody in the workforce knows that it was only half-heartedly or fakely implemented. And only the dumb leader at the top doesn't realize that everybody was gaming the system. Number four, tools for finding tipping points. Now, tipping points is the opposite of Eastern causality, the 10,000 bee stings causality. Tipping points is finding the one point where a slight input changes the whole state of the system. This is the Western lazy aristocrats way of doing science, as opposed to the Japanese total quality way of changing systems. Dr. Deming said that in quality terms, the Western system of tipping point finding for quality and the Eastern system of 10,000 bee stings for quality competed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and the Japanese Eastern system absolutely trounced worldwide in every culture of the world, every nation of the world, every tradition of the world, absolutely blew away the Western tipping point thing. So there is a real issue that the tipping point Western way has got a fundamental flaw in it, or weakness compared to the Eastern way. However, there are a few places where we do have clear evidence of the Einsteinian sort that the tipping points of powerful ones can occasionally be found. Turns out there are methods of finding tipping points. They're not taught in colleges. They're not taught in corporate training programs. I think I'm the only person in the world at the moment with a formal course for teaching them. You can do it. You have to plot problems and imbalances on comprehensive maps of dynamics. And if the maps are comprehensive, truly comprehensive, you will find imbalances in where problems appear and causes appear. And those imbalances and those clumps of causes and imbalances will then give you a hint as to what's the dynamic on that map of comprehensive map of dynamics causing the problem after problem to recur. And there's a tipping point there at that point in the model. Number 5, tools and practices for improving societal solving. And this is things like causal reading. People don't know how to read for causes when they read texts. And they do a sloppy, amateurish causal readings, which grossly distort the actual causal information in the text. So I have to teach people to read causes in paragraphs. Number 6, self-causation. You want to change yourself, but you are the distorted self that has to make you be undistortedly changed. You are filled with the self that is the contents you're trying to change. So the doer and the doee is the same distorted system, trying to change itself. And this is what religion is for. It's an authority outside of yourself that you give yourself to in order to have a detached emotional view of yourself that allows you to stop loving parts of yourself enough to change them. And if you don't project obeisance and love to something powerful and wonderful outside of yourself enough to stop loving yourself all the time and start rigorously looking at yourself from a whole society point of view and looking at your flaws, then you can detach love of yourself from pieces of yourself enough to change them. So without that authority outside of the self for changing the self, self-change does not occur. And religions have known this for eons. And that's why they have gods and other kinds of authorities as this way to have an authority outside of yourself by which to rigorously evaluate yourself, stop loving pieces of yourself, and change them. This is the self-causation component in leadership. Then there's another point 7, self-causation point. Ancient religious practices, modern therapies, and performing arts all have exactly the same self-causation, self-change, self-making process. Exactly the same one. And it's called the despair doorway, changing being X to having X. And it involves shrinking what your pride is based on. And it involves losing love for yourself. Seriously losing love for yourself. So you can't stand yourself. And that despair at ever reaching your fondest goals as who you now are, that despair is what opens the door to growth. Where you stop being male and you stop loving your own maleness and you start doubting your own maleness's worth. You start managing maleness and using it where it's worthwhile and stopping it where it's a pain in the neck and doesn't work, for example. Number point 8, self-causation, another third self-causation point. How do you manage your own emotions? And this is the biggest problem that most people have their entire lives. You use the arts to manage your own emotions. And if you don't have arts, being in terms of you're not composing and you're not performing arts as part of your daily life, and you're not seriously engaged with the composing and performing done by others, then chances are your emotions are unmanaged and unmanageable. And many therapists have stated to their clients, go out to the theater, go out to the coffee houses, go out to the folk song venues, and listen to what other people are struggling with in their experience through as they express it in the arts. And then the fourth, which is point 9, the fourth self-causation point here is diversity science. And this is that diversity makes us more innovative, everybody says. But most of us experience diversity slows down performance and interferes with getting things done, which is true. Well, it turns out that using the word diversity in a general sloppy way like that is bad thinking. There are kinds of diversity with a complex mapping onto kinds of tasks. Certain kinds of diversity help certain kinds of tasks. Certain kinds of tasks call for certain kinds of diversity as contributors. And Page, for example, at the Santa Fe Institute in Princeton, has been writing a couple of books, 3 books now probably, on this mapping. It's not hard, it's not difficult. In academia, you can get a famous position by publishing a couple of papers on stuff like this. But if you read it, it's pretty commonsensical stuff. Just stopping the idea that all diversity everywhere makes people more innovative. It's not true. Most diversity just makes things not happen. Ups the cost of everything and makes everything troublesome. Some kinds of diversity up the innovation of some kinds of tasks, but not others. And you actually have to do the work of exploring this space between mapping of task types to diversity types to find out who helps what.